A logger found an old medicine bottle inside a hollow tree, and when he pulled out what was inside, he went pale. What those papers said had been waiting in that trunk for nearly 20 years, and the man who put them there had been sleeping just fine the whole time. Gabe Tillman set his chainsaw down in the wet duff and read every page in the fog. And by the time he finished, the forest around him felt different, quieter, and not in a good way. He'd parked his Ford F-150 at the landing before first light, the way he always did. The fog was thick enough that the trees across the draw were just shapes, dark against gray, and his breath came out in small clouds when he shouldered his saw and started up the slope. Caulk boots biting into the soft ground, the needle duff springy underfoot, the smell of wet bark and moss and something older underneath, the smell of old growth, which was different from second growth, the way an old man's hands were different from a boy's. Douglas County had been logging this drainage for 100 years, and Gabe Tillman had been doing his part for 38 of them. He was 57 years old. He'd started falling timber when he was 19, following his uncle into the woods outside Glide the summer after high school, and somewhere along the way the work had become the shape of his life. He had a cabin outside Roseburg that he owned outright, bought it with 15 years of overtime and no vacations, and a blue heeler named Soot who was currently locked in the truck cab waiting for Gabe to come back down the mountain. He had an ex-wife in Medford who'd once told him he was more comfortable in the woods than in any room with people, and she hadn't been wrong. He had a router table in his workshop and a habit of carving small wooden animals late at night, elk and ravens, and once a very small bear that he'd left on the porch of his neighbor's kid without saying anything about it. What he didn't have, heading up that slope in the dark, was any particular feeling about the day. It was a Wednesday in October. It was a cutting unit he'd been working for 2 weeks. It was the job. The Douglas fir he was set to fall that morning stood at the top of the unit, back against a basalt outcrop, 6 feet across at the base. 300 years old if it was a day. The company was calling this one of the last old-growth units they'd work in this drainage. The economics had shifted toward plantation timber, faster rotation, more predictable yield. Gabe had heard that before. He'd believe it when he saw them stop cutting. He walked the tree first, the way he always did. Checked the lean, looked up through the canopy for widowmakers, dead branches that could come down on a faller and kill him before the tree ever moved. He found one, a broken cedar limb about 60 feet up, and knocked it loose with a long pole before he touched his saw. The limb came down with a sound like a rifle shot and stuck in the duff 6 feet from where he was standing. He looked at it for a moment, then he put his earplugs in. The undercut took about 4 minutes. He cut a smooth notch on the fall side, the sawdust coming out orange-red and sweet-smelling, piling up on the toes of his boots. He drove the back cut in from the other side, working carefully, feeling the tree begin to take the weight of the cut. Then the wedge. 2 blows with the maul, the tree groaning low in its roots, the snap when the holding wood gave, and the sound of 300 years of Douglas fir coming down through the canopy, branches breaking like gunshots all the way to the ground. The mountain shook. The fog swirled where the tree had been. Gabe stepped back and watched it settle, his saw at his side, and there was a moment, there was always a moment, where he just let the thing be done. Then he moved to buck the log. He started at the root end, working toward the crown, cutting the trunk into sections the yarder could lift. The second cut was about 12 feet from the base, and when his saw cleared through the last inch of wood, the log face split open and he saw the hollow. It was the size of a large coffee can, maybe bigger, running up into the trunk for a foot or more. Common in old fir, the heartwood rots from the center out over centuries, leaving a cavity the tree grows around. Usually it held nothing but darkness and old water, and sometimes a pack rat nest gone to dust. This one held a brown glass bottle, about 9 inches tall, the kind of thick-walled pharmaceutical bottle that pharmacies used to sell patent medicines in. The glass had gone smoky with age. The mouth was sealed with what looked like paraffin wax, poured in and hardened, yellowed and cracked at the edges. Around the bottle, packed tight, was a folded piece of canvas, oil-stained, that had kept the worst of the moisture out. Gabe reached in and worked the bottle free with both hands. He turned it over. No label, or whatever label had been there, was long gone. He could see papers through the glass, rolled tight, filling the inside. He pulled the paraffin seal with his pocket knife, working around the circumference, and when it came loose, he tipped the bottle and shook the papers out onto the palm of his hand. They were damp at the edges and smelled of mildew, but they held together. He unrolled them carefully, section by section, and spread them on the flat face of the log. Safety Inspection Reports, Pacific Ridge Timber Company. He knew that name. Everyone who'd worked timber in Douglas County for more than a decade knew that name. They'd operated 3 camps in this drainage from the 1980s through 2008, when they'd folded the Oregon operation and sold the timberland to a land investment trust. The reports were dated between 2002 and 2007. Each report appeared twice, an original and a second version. The original versions were typed forms from the Oregon OSHA Inspection Office, each one flagging specific hazards: frayed rigging cables in Unit 17, an unmarked snag tree in Unit U.C. 44, defective choker bells throughout the lower camp, a failed brake on a yarder drum that had been documented in 2 prior inspections and still not replaced. Standard language, but the kind of language that meant a crew chief was supposed to shut down operations until the hazard was corrected. The second versions of each report had the same header, the same form numbers, the same dates, but the hazard findings were gone. Replaced with language saying each item had been reviewed and found to be within compliance. Each second version was signed at the bottom by the company's safety compliance officer. The signature was neat and practiced, the name printed below it in block letters: Felix Eastman. Gabe knew that name too. He sat down on the fallen log. The fog moved around him. His hands weren't quite steady when he turned to the next page. 3 men had died in Pacific Ridge timber units between 2003 and 2007. He knew that too. The whole county knew it, in the way that timber country holds its dead close. Harley Wooten, rigging man, 2005. Cody Ferris, choker setter, 2007. And before both of them, in September of 2004, Tom Clements. Cable logging unit on the North Umpqua drainage. Snag tree came down on him while the yarder was running. The company investigation said Tom hadn't been watching his position. The company investigation said it was an accident. The company investigation relied on safety inspection reports that showed the unit had been properly cleared of hazard trees before operations began. Gabe shuffled to the report for Unit U.C. 47. The original inspector's report was dated the 11th of September 2004, the day before Tom Clements died. It flagged 3 unmarked snag trees in the unit, one of them described as a dead-standing fir approximately 90 feet tall with visible root decay. High risk of sudden failure under yarder vibration. The corrected version, dated the same day, stated that all snag trees in Unit U.C. 47 had been identified and felled prior to operations. Signed, Felix Eastman. Stapled to the corrected version was a small aluminum tag. Tree marking tag, the kind cruisers use to mark individual trees in a unit. This one read UC-47 on one line. And below it, stamped into the metal, September 12, 2004. September 12, 2004, the day Tom Clements was killed. Gabe sat on that log for a long time. The fog came and went. Somewhere below him, the North Umpqua was running fast and gray. And somewhere in Myrtle Creek, about 40 miles south, Tom Clements' widow was starting her day not knowing that the thing she'd been told for 20 years was a lie, and that the lie was sitting in Gabe Tillman's hands on a mountainside in October. He turned over the last sheet of paper. A handwritten list on plain white paper, columns of dates and dollar amounts, each line ending in 2 initials, R.H. He didn't know who R.H. was, not yet. He rolled the papers carefully and put them back in the bottle. He wrapped the bottle in the canvas and put it in his vest pocket. Then he picked up his saw, shut off the fuel valve, and started back down the mountain. He left the log half-bucked and the rest of the unit standing. He'd deal with the company later. Right now, he needed to get somewhere he could think, and that meant getting off this mountain and sitting down somewhere quiet with a cup of coffee and these papers spread on a table where he could see them properly. He reached the truck and opened the cab door. Soot jumped out, did one fast circuit of the landing, sniffing tire tracks, and jumped back in when Gabe whistled. Gabe sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. He looked at the shape of the mountain through the fog. He had known Felix Eastman for 15 years. Not well. They'd worked different crews, different companies mostly, and Felix had moved into management while Gabe stayed on the saw. But he'd been at the funeral for Tom Clements. He remembered Violet standing at the graveside with that particular stillness that comes over people when grief is too large to move around in. He remembered thinking she looked like a woman who had already decided something, but hadn't figured out yet what it was. He started the truck and pulled out of the landing. The gravel road wound down through the timber, logging trucks passing him going the other way, the drivers lifting 2 fingers off the wheel, the way timber people do when they pass each other in the hills. He lifted his own fingers back, automatic, and kept driving. He didn't know yet how far this would go, but the bottle was in his pocket and the papers were inside it, and somewhere in Drain, Oregon, Felix Eastman was sitting in his log house making chainsaw carvings for the craft fair, and he had no idea that a 300-year-old Douglas fir had just given up his secret. Gabe's cabin sat on 4 acres off a county road outside Roseburg, back in the timber far enough that you couldn't see the road from the porch. He'd built the workshop himself, a single-room structure attached to the back of the cabin by a covered walkway, with a concrete floor and a shop light on a long cord that he could move wherever he needed it. The workbench ran the full length of the back wall. Scarred Douglas fir planking, stained with linseed oil and wood shavings, and the occasional spilled coffee. He had a router, a bandsaw, a hand-plane collection going back 40 years, and along the high shelf above the bench, a row of small wooden figures he hadn't given away yet. An elk, 2 ravens, a small man with his hands in his pockets. He spread the papers on the workbench at a little past 2 in the afternoon, with the shop light pulled close and a fresh cup of coffee going cold at his elbow. Soot lay under the bench with his chin on his front paws, watching Gabe the way dogs do when they sense something is off but can't place what. Gabe read through everything twice. The reports were organized by unit and date, though he didn't think whoever had rolled them up had taken time to sort them. It looked more like someone had grabbed a stack off a desk and shoved them into the bottle fast, in whatever order they came to hand. He arranged them himself, oldest to newest, and built a simple picture. Between the spring of 2002 and the fall of 2007, Felix Eastman had filed corrected inspection reports for 11 different cutting units in the Pacific Ridge timber operation. In each case, the original Oregon OSHA report flagged 1 or more serious hazards. In each case, Felix's corrected version stated the hazards had been resolved. In most cases, Gabe suspected in all cases, they had not been resolved. The company had simply kept operating. 3 of those 11 units were places where men had died. Gabe pulled the unit reports for each death and laid them side by side. Unit U.C. 44, 2005. The original inspector flagged defective rigging on a skyline yarder, specifically a mainline cable showing visible wear and fraying at the drum connection. The corrected report stated the cable had been inspected and found within tolerance. 3 weeks later, Harley Wooten was struck by a rigging failure in Unit U.C. 44. The company investigation called it a natural equipment failure, sudden and unpredictable. Unit MC 12, 2007. The original inspector documented a defective choker bell, the hardware that attached the choker cable to the logs being yarded, on 2 separate pieces of equipment in the lower camp. The corrected report stated both pieces had been inspected, the hardware replaced or repaired. 8 weeks later, Cody Ferris, a choker setter, 23 years old, Gabe confirmed that detail from his own memory, was killed when a choker bell failed and a log shifted on the slope. The company investigation called it a tragic accident. And Unit U.C. 47, 2004, the snag tree. Tom Clements. Gabe already knew that one. He sat back and looked at the three reports together. Each death was preceded by an inspection that flagged the exact hazard that would kill the man. Each inspection had been falsified. Each falsification bore Felix Eastman's signature. He thought about what that meant, not legally, not yet, but in plain human terms. A man sat at a desk and signed papers that said dangerous things had been made safe. He did it knowing they hadn't been. He did it because shutting down a unit for repairs cost the company money and cost him standing with the company. And because he had apparently decided, on some morning that probably felt like any other morning, that the men working in those units were an acceptable risk to carry. That was the plain human meaning of those signatures. Gabe drank the rest of the cold coffee and went inside to make a fresh pot. He stood at the kitchen window while the coffee brewed, looking out at the tree line. He was thinking about a morning in the fall of 2004, a morning he hadn't been part of, but had heard about enough times that he'd built a picture of it. Tom Clements arriving at the landing, Tom Clements signing in, pulling on his gear, heading up the slope into Unit U.C. 47. The yarder running, the snag tree, 90 feet of dead fir with rotted roots, standing invisible in the canopy to anyone who hadn't been told to look for it, starting to lean under the vibration of the drum. And Tom, somewhere in the falling zone, not paying attention to the right thing at the right moment because nobody had told him there was a 90-foot widowmaker waiting to come down on him. The company said he wasn't paying attention. They were right that he wasn't watching the snag tree. They neglected to mention they were the reason he didn't know to watch it. He'd met Tom Clements twice that he could remember. Once at a union meeting in Roseburg, once at a company picnic years before the accident. Medium-built man, dark hair going gray early, the kind of quiet that came from working outdoors your whole life. Had a wife named Violet and kids that Gabe couldn't remember the number of. Seemed like a decent man. Gabe thought most of the men he'd worked alongside over the years were decent men, and it had not protected a single one of them from the specific dangers of the job. He poured his coffee and went back to the workshop. The handwritten list was what he kept coming back to. Dates, dollar amounts, the initials RH. 22 entries spanning from early 2002 to the middle of 2007. The amounts ranged from $300 to $800 per entry. He added them up on the back of a feed store receipt with a stub of pencil. $41,200. Paid to RH over 5.5 years. He didn't know who RH was. But the list was in the same bottle as the falsified inspection reports, which meant Felix had kept them together, and the only reason to keep a payment list with safety fraud documents was if the payments were related to the fraud. Which meant RH was someone Felix had been paying to keep the inspections quiet, or to space them out, or to look the other way when he filed his corrected reports. There was a state safety inspector, Gabe thought. There was always a state inspector attached to a county's timber operations. He didn't know who had covered Douglas County in those years. He went to the county courthouse in Roseburg the next morning. He'd put the papers back in the medicine bottle and locked the bottle in the steel toolbox in the bed of his truck, the same box where he kept his spare chains and his emergency kit, with a padlock he changed the combination on twice a year. It seemed like the right place for something he wasn't ready to hand over yet. The Douglas County Courthouse was a brown brick building on Kane Street that smelled of floor wax and old paper. Gabe found the records window and asked for the OSHA investigation files for the 3 Pacific Ridge timber fatalities: Wooten, Ferris, and Clements. The clerk, a woman in her late 50s who wore reading glasses on a lanyard and moved with the unhurried certainty of someone who had worked in the same building for 30 years, looked at him over the glasses and asked if he had a case number. He told her he didn't. She told him it might take a while. She came back with 3 folders in under 15 minutes, which suggested she either knew where everything was or had dealt with these files before. The files were thin. Each one ran less than 30 pages: incident reports, company investigation summaries, the OSHA case determination, and the closure notice. The OSHA determinations in all three cases had found no violation, citing the company's inspection records as evidence of proper hazard identification and remediation. The inspection records cited were Felix Eastman's corrected versions. Gabe photographed every page with the old 35mm camera he kept in his truck glove box. He'd started carrying it years ago to document cutting unit conditions in case of a dispute, a habit from a safety-conscious foreman who'd told him early on that a photograph was worth 1,000 arguments. He wound the film and noted which roll he'd used in a small notebook he kept in the same compartment. He was sitting in his truck in the courthouse parking lot, writing up his notes, when his eye caught the name at the bottom of the OSHA determination letter for Tom Clements' death. The regional compliance officer who'd signed off on the no violation finding. Roy Hurd. He wrote the name in his notebook and looked at it for a moment. R.H. He sat with that for a minute, letting it settle. Then he started the truck and drove south on I-5 toward Myrtle Creek. He'd been thinking about this drive for 2 days, and he still wasn't sure what he was going to say. Violet Clements had lived with one story about her husband's death for 20 years, and he was about to tell her the story was wrong. He'd thought, on the drive down from the mountain, that she'd want to know. He still thought that. He just wasn't sure that wanting to know and being ready to hear it were the same thing, and he didn't have a way to find out in advance. He took the Myrtle Creek exit and turned east on the county road, past the Dollar General and the feed store and the Baptist church with the marquee sign out front. The house was on a side street, a white frame house with a covered porch and a garden along the front walk that had gone to weeds sometime in the last year or two. A ceramic pot by the front steps held what might have been petunias once. Gabe parked at the curb. He didn't get out right away. Soot, who'd ridden down on the bench seat, looked at the house and then looked at Gabe. Gabe looked at the house. 20 years was a long time to carry something that wasn't true. He thought about that. He thought about Violet Clements at that graveside, the stillness of her, the decision behind her eyes. He thought about all the mornings between then and now that she'd woken up with the company's verdict on her husband. Inattentive, not careful enough, not paying attention. He got out of the truck. He was standing on the porch with his hand raised to knock when he heard footsteps inside, slow and deliberate, and then the door opened and Violet Clements looked at him through the screen. Gray-haired, straight-backed, her hands bent at the knuckles in the way of a person whose joints had hardened against them. She looked at him the way a woman looks at a stranger on her porch, measuring, not afraid. "Help you?" she said. "My name's Gabe Tillman," he said. "I work timber up in the North Umpqua drainage. I think I found something you need to see." She looked at him for a long moment. The screen door between them caught the last of the afternoon light. "Well," she said finally, "you'd better come in." Violet Clements' living room was the kind of room that had been arranged once, a long time ago, and not changed since. A blue sofa with armrests worn pale at the corners, a side table with a lamp that had a cream-colored shade gone slightly yellow. On the wall above the television, a framed photograph of Tom Clements in his gear, suspenders, hard hat, caulk boots, standing in front of a big fir with one hand on the bark and squinting into the sun. He looked like a man who was comfortable in that particular place, which was the only place he'd ever wanted to be. Violet sat in the armchair across from Gabe with her hands in her lap. She'd made coffee without asking if he wanted any, moving through the kitchen with the careful deliberateness of someone whose hands hurt, but who wasn't going to mention it. She set the cups on the low table between them and lowered herself into the chair and looked at him. He told her everything. He didn't try to soften it or build up to it. He'd decided on the drive down that she deserved the plain version, not the managed version. He told her about the fur, the hollow, the medicine bottle sealed with paraffin wax. He told her about the 2 versions of each report. He told her about Felix Eastman's signature on every corrected version. He laid the photographic facts down in order, the way he'd lay a cut, and when he was done, he waited. Violet was quiet for a moment. She looked at the photograph of Tom on the wall. Then she looked back at Gabe. "I always knew," she said. Her voice was even. Not bitter, not relieved, Just a statement of plain fact. The way you'd say it was 40 degrees outside. The lawsuit, Gabe said, filed it in 2005. Lawyer in Eugene took it on contingency because he thought we had something. She paused. The court dismissed it. Said the company's inspection records showed the site was properly prepared. Said there was no evidence of negligence. She looked at her coffee cup. I sat in that courtroom and listened to a judge read out Felix Eastman's inspection report as if it were scripture. Thought I was losing my mind. You weren't. I know that now. I knew it then too. Knowing and proving aren't the same animal. She was quiet for a moment. Tom was not a careless man. 22 years I was married to him. He checked his equipment every morning the way other men check their coffee. Automatic, because it mattered. The idea that he wasn't paying attention. She stopped. I stopped arguing about it after a while because arguing without evidence just makes you look like a grieving widow who can't accept what happened, so I stopped. Gabe nodded. He didn't say anything. There were other men, she said. It wasn't a question. Harley Wooten, Cody Ferris. She closed her eyes briefly. I heard about Wooten, I thought. She shook her head. I thought it was the same thing. Another accident, another investigation, another report saying the site was clean. She opened her eyes. Do their families know? Not yet. I came to you first. She looked at him steadily. Why? Gabe thought about that for a second. Because Tom was first, he said. And because whatever needs to happen next, you ought to have a say in how it starts. Violet was quiet long enough that the refrigerator in the kitchen cycled on and hummed for a while and cycled off again. Outside, a truck went by on the county road, rattling the single-pane window beside the television. What do you need from me? She said. Nothing right now. I need to talk to a lawyer. I think this is bigger than a civil case. That payment list points toward a state inspector, and if that's what it is, it becomes a criminal matter. He hesitated. It's going to take time, and when it moves, it's going to move loudly. I want you to be ready for that. She looked at him with something that was almost impatience. Mr. Tillman, she said, I have been ready for 20 years. Take all the time you need. He called Constance Mercer's office in Eugene the following morning from the phone in his cabin. He'd gotten her name from his union rep. She handled timber industry cases and had a reputation for not being impressed by timber company lawyers, which was the relevant quality. Her assistant put him through after a short wait, and he explained the situation in about 4 minutes, the way he'd explain a cutting problem to another faller. The essential facts, the sequence, no decoration. Constance listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, Are the originals secure? Locked toolbox in my truck. Padlock. How many people know you have them? You, the widow, nobody else. Keep it that way for now. She was quiet for a moment, thinking. The civil angle is straightforward. The falsified reports directly caused a wrongful death case to fail, and we have new evidence to reopen it. But you're right that the payment list is the more important piece. If RH is Roy Hurd, and it sounds like it is, that's bribery of a state official, which is a felony. That brings in the U.S. Attorney's Office potentially, federal jurisdiction. She paused. I need to see the documents in person. Can you come to Eugene? When? Thursday works. Bring everything. Originals, your photographs, your notes. He drove to Eugene on Thursday in the rain, the kind of steady western Oregon rain that didn't storm, just settled in and stayed. Constance Mercer's office was on the 4th floor of a building 2 blocks from the federal courthouse, a working office with stacked files, and a window that looked out at the parking structure across the street. She was about 50, compact and precise in her movements, with reading glasses she took off and put on repeatedly while she went through the documents. She spent 40 minutes with the reports and the payment list, not saying much, occasionally making a small mark on her legal pad. Finally, she took her glasses off and set them on the desk. The dual reports are damning on their own, she said. Foreman files false safety clearances. Men die in the exact conditions flagged by the original inspections. That's a pattern a jury can follow. The payment list complicates Felix's defense considerably. He can't claim he was just following company pressure if he was also personally profiting from the arrangement. She tapped the list with one finger. I want to identify Heard definitively before we file anything. Do you have any corroborating link between Heard and Felix beyond the initials? Heard signed the OSHA no violation finding on Tom Clemens's death. His signature's on file at the courthouse. That establishes Heard was the regional compliance officer. It doesn't by itself prove he took money. It could be argued he made a legitimate determination based on the inspection records he was given. She thought for a moment. I need another thread. Someone who knew both of them, or a financial record. Anything that puts money moving from Felix to Heard. I'll look. She nodded. I'll start drafting the motion to reopen Violet Clemens's wrongful death case. That gets the civil ball rolling and creates a formal record. She looked at him. Once we file, word will get around. Felix will know. Be aware of that. Word got around in less than 48 hours. Gabe was working the landing on a different unit, running his saw through second-growth fir, when he heard boots on the logging road behind him, and turned to find Felix Eastman coming up the slope. Felix was wearing clean canvas work pants and a wax jacket, no gear, no saw. He was dressed like a man who had come to visit, not to work. He was thicker through the middle than Gabe remembered, hair gone fully white, a handsome face with a practiced smile that fit him the way a well-worn tool fits a hand. Gabe Tillman, Felix said, like they were running into each other at the hardware store. Heard you were working up in this drainage. Felix. Gabe set his saw down on the log he'd been bucking and straightened up. Long way from drain. Well, I do some consulting up this way. Stopping by to say hello to a few of the old-timers. Felix looked around at the unit with the easy appraisal of a man who'd spent his career in timber. Still running the saw yourself. Good on you. Somebody has to. Felix smiled. I heard you pulled a bottle out of a hollow fir up on the old Pacific Ridge ground. People talk. He said it the way you'd mention hearing about someone's new truck, casually, the smile staying exactly where it was. Old trees hold all kinds of junk. Found a mason jar in a cottonwood once, back in the 80s. Old love letter inside. Some poor woman writing to a soldier. Touching, but... He shrugged. Funny the things people put in trees. Funny, Gabe said. I wouldn't lose any sleep over whatever you found up there. Old paperwork, old company records. That stuff's been obsolete for 20 years. He looked at Gabe directly. The smile was still present, but something behind it had gone flat. No point in stirring up a lot of old grief for people who've already made their peace. Some people haven't made their peace, Gabe said. Felix looked at him for a moment. Well, he said, people do better when they let things settle. He looked around the unit once more, that easy professional scan, then looked back at Gabe. You take care of yourself up here. These old second-growth units, they can be tricky. Trees grow fast and funny. He raised one hand in a casual farewell and started back down the slope. Gabe watched him go until the trees took him. He stood there for a moment with his hand on his saw. His jaw was tight. He thought about the way Felix had said old grief, like grief had an expiration date, like Violet Clemens sitting in that armchair with her bent hands, and 20 years of the wrong story was just a thing that had settled naturally, like silt in a pond. He picked up his saw and went back to work. He finished the unit, loaded his tools, and drove to the landing at the bottom. When he reached his truck, he stopped. All 4 tires were flat. Not slow leaks, flat. The side walls visibly punctured, the rims sitting on the gravel. He walked around the truck and looked at each one. Clean cuts, not road damage. Someone had taken a knife to all 4 while the truck sat at the landing. The medicine bottle was in the locked toolbox in the bed. The toolbox was untouched. The padlock was still set, the hasp undamaged. Whoever had done this hadn't gotten in, but they'd made their point. Gabe got his flashlight out of the cab and looked at the cuts. Same blade angle on all 4, smooth entry. Somebody who knew what they were doing and hadn't been in a hurry. He stood up and looked at the logging road in both directions. Empty. The trees stood around the landing the way trees always stood, silent and indifferent to the business of men. He went to the cab and got the CB radio handset. His dog was in the cab, standing with his front paws on the dash, looking at the tires. "I know," Gabe said. He called for a tow. While he waited, he sat on the tailgate with the toolbox at his back and looked at the mountain. And he thought about Felix, walking up that slope in his clean boots with his practiced smile. And he understood that whatever was coming was going to be less polite than a conversation about mason jars and love letters. The tow truck driver was a heavy-set man named Dale Spurlock, who ran the only garage in Camas Valley and had been doing so for 26 years. He arrived in 40 minutes, looked at all 4 tires without saying anything, looked at Gabe and said, "You step on somebody's property line?" Something like that. Dale loaded the truck onto the flatbed with the efficiency of a man who'd done it 10,000 times. On the drive back down to the garage, he didn't ask any more questions, which Gabe appreciated. When the new tires were on, Dale had 2 of the right size in stock and sourced the other 2 from a shop in Roseburg with 1 phone call. Gabe paid in cash and drove home. He spent the evening in the workshop, not working, just sitting at the bench with a piece of half-carved cedar in his hands, turning it over, not carving. Soot lay in his usual spot under the bench. The shop light cast everything in a yellow cone and left the corners of the room in shadow. Outside, rain had started up again, the kind of soft, persistent rain that Douglas County specialized in from October through April, tapping on the metal workshop roof in a sound that was almost a voice. Gabe thought about what Felix had said on the mountain. Old grief, let things settle. He thought about the ease of the man, the clean boots, the practiced friendliness, the way he'd scanned the cutting unit like he still owned everything in sight. Felix had built a comfortable life on top of what he'd done. Chainsaw carvings at the craft fair. A consultancy that traded on his reputation as a safety expert. 18 years of running crews as a foreman, which on a resume looked like leadership and accountability, and which in fact had been 18 years of deciding that production mattered more than people and signing his name to prove it. The thing Gabe kept coming back to was the bottle. Felix hadn't put those papers in a tree by accident. You didn't seal a glass bottle with paraffin wax and stuff it into a hollow fir on a remote mountainside because you were being careless. You did it because you wanted the papers to survive, and you didn't want anyone to find them. You did it because you wanted insurance, something you could point to if the company ever tried to put the deaths entirely on you, something that documented the arrangement with Roy Hurd, something that proved you hadn't been operating alone. It was the kind of move a certain kind of man made when he understood that the thing he was doing was wrong and wanted a way out if the wall ever came down. Felix had hidden the evidence. He'd also preserved it. That said something about the man that Gabe didn't quite have words for, but that he understood in his gut. He set the cedar piece down and went to bed. In the morning, he drove to Coos Bay. Harley Wooten's widow was named Nadine, and she lived in a blue house 3 blocks from the bay in a neighborhood of small houses with fishing gear stacked on the side porches. She was 62, broad-shouldered, with short gray hair and the direct manner of a woman who'd been answering her own door and making her own decisions for a long time. When Gabe explained who he was and why he'd come, she stood in the doorway for a moment, then stepped back and let him in without a word. Her kitchen smelled of coffee and something baking. A terrier mix watched Gabe from a dog bed in the corner with great suspicion. Nadine Wooten listened to the same account he'd given Violet. The tree, the bottle, the dual reports, Felix's signatures. She listened with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "I have Harley's lunch pail," she said. Gabe looked at her. He kept a notebook in it, wrote things down while he was eating, end of the day, things he wanted to remember or things that bothered him. She paused. "After the accident, I kept the pail the way it was. I don't know why, I just couldn't put it away." She stood up and went to the back of the house and came back carrying a black metal lunch pail, the old oval top kind, dented and paint worn. She set it on the table between them. Inside, below a thermos sleeve and a flattened wax paper wrapper, was a small spiral notebook. The cover had Harley printed on it in marker. Nadine pushed it across to Gabe. He opened it carefully. The pages were filled with Harley Wooten's handwriting, large, unhurried letters, the handwriting of a man who hadn't spent a lot of years at a desk. Most entries were short. "Yarder drum making noise again," told Felix. "Nothing done." "Main line looks bad on the high lead block," told Felix. "Nothing done." Then, 3 pages from the end, an entry that was longer than the others. "Talked to the state inspector today, young guy named Hurd. Told him about the cable on U.C. 44, same cable that's been flagged twice. He said he'd look at it. Then he said, kind of quiet, that I shouldn't expect surprise inspections on our units, that the schedule was adjusted. Didn't say why. Looked like he didn't want to be saying it at all. I think Felix pays him. I can't prove it, but I think it." Gabe read the entry twice. Then he looked up at Nadine. "I need to photograph this," he said. "Take the whole notebook," she said. "I've had it long enough." He drove south from Coos Bay on Route 42, through the Coast Range, the timber coming in close on both sides of the road. He was thinking about Harley Wooten writing that entry. "I think Felix pays him. I can't prove it." Writing it in a spiral notebook in his lunch pail, a private record nobody was supposed to see. Harley had known. He'd known the way working men know things in industries where the boss controls the information, not with documents, not with proof, just with the accumulated evidence of what gets fixed and what doesn't, what gets inspected and what gets passed over, and the look on a young inspector's face when he says something he wasn't supposed to say. 3 weeks after he wrote that entry, Harley Wooten was struck by a rigging failure in Unit U.C. 44, the cable he'd flagged twice. Gabe drove and didn't say anything out loud, but he thought several things that he was glad Soot couldn't report. Constance filed the motion to reopen Violet's wrongful death case on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday afternoon, Felix Eastman's attorney, a man named Wallace Corbett, who practiced out of Roseburg and wore suits that cost more than most loggers made in a month, had filed a counter-motion arguing that the newly presented evidence was unverified and insufficient to reopen a settled case. The Roseburg News Review ran a 2-paragraph item about the motion on page 7 of the county section. It was brief and neutral, the kind of item that reads like a weather report. But it was enough. Gabe's phone rang that evening. He didn't recognize the number. A man's voice, lower middle-aged, careful. "Mr. Tillman, you don't know me. My name is Owen Phelps. I worked in the Pacific Ridge main office from 2001 to 2008, bookkeeping and accounts payable." Gabe waited. "I saw the item in the paper," Owen said. "I've been sitting with something for a long time. I believe I need to tell someone." "Tell me," Gabe said. "There was a line item in our accounts payable going back to about 2002, listed as compliance consulting, quarterly payments to a sole proprietorship called Hurd Safety Services, $1,500 per quarter. I processed those checks myself." A pause. "Mr. Eastman approved every one of them." Gabe was quiet for a moment. "Roy Hurd," he said. "I don't know the first name," Owen said. "I just processed what came across my desk. But I have copies of 6 of those payment records. I kept them. I don't know why exactly. Maybe because it didn't sit right, and I thought someday someone would ask." His voice was careful, like a man walking on uncertain ground. "If someone needed to see them, I could provide them." "I think someone needs to see them," Gabe said. He called Constance's cell phone immediately after hanging up. She answered on the second ring. He told her about Owen Phelps and the payment records, and there was a brief silence on her end before she said, "That's the financial thread. That's what I thought. Get him to me. Don't let him change his mind over the weekend." Another pause. "Gabe, when this filing becomes public knowledge, and it will, probably by Monday, Felix is going to understand that the documents are more than photocopies. The payment trail being corroborated changes his calculus considerably." "I know. Watch yourself." He hung up and sat in the kitchen in the dark for a while. Soot came in from the workshop and put his head on Gabe's knee. The rain was still going, slow and steady, tapping on the roof. Gabe put his hand on the dog's head and thought about Harley Wooten's notebook. I think Felix pays him. I can't prove it. Well, Harley, somebody can prove it now. He got up and went to the workshop and turned on the shop light and picked up the cedar piece. He started carving again, slowly at first, then, with more attention, the way the work came back to him when he let it. He was making a standing figure, a man in a hard hat. He didn't think about why. He carved until nearly midnight, and when he went to bed, the cabin felt different than it had in weeks. Not lighter exactly, but less like a place where something was waiting, and more like a place where something was almost ready to move. He was asleep when the sound woke him, somewhere outside, the workshop side of the cabin, a sound that didn't belong to the rain or the trees, a sound like boots on gravel moving carefully. He lay still for 3 seconds. Soot was already at the bedroom door, stiff-legged, the low vibration of a growl starting in his chest. Gabe got up, pulled on his jeans and boots, and went to the window. The workshop light was on. He had turned it off before bed. He was certain of it. He didn't go out the front door. He went through the kitchen to the back, moving in the dark without a light, and came around the side of the cabin through the covered walkway. The workshop door was ajar. He'd left it latched, he was certain, and the shop light inside threw a yellow strip across the gravel. He could hear movement inside, the careful sound of someone who was trying not to be heard and wasn't quite managing it. He pushed the door open. A man was at the workbench, young, late 20s, maybe 30, in a dark jacket and work gloves, going through the drawers methodically. He'd already pulled 2 drawers out and set them on the bench. He had a small flashlight in his mouth and was using both hands on the drawers, which was why he didn't hear Gabe until Gabe was 3 feet behind him. Gabe reached past him and turned the shop light up full. The man spun around. His flashlight dropped. He was lean-faced, dark-eyed, with the look of someone who'd planned this more carefully than it was going. He looked at Gabe and didn't say anything, calculating. "I don't keep much in the house," Gabe said. "What is it you're actually looking for?" The man said nothing. "You work for Felix Eastman," Gabe said. It wasn't a question. It was the only answer that fit. The man picked up his flashlight off the floor, straightened, and walked past Gabe to the door without a word. Gabe let him go. He wasn't going to get a name by grabbing him, and grabbing him would just complicate what was already complicated. He watched the man disappear into the dark through the trees, listened to the sound of boots on the county road, and then a truck engine turning over and pulling away north toward Roseburg. He went back inside and checked the workshop. The drawers had been searched, but nothing was taken. There was nothing in them but hardware, carving tools, router bits, and a box of chainsaw files. The medicine bottle was in the steel toolbox in his truck, which was parked in the carport on the other side of the cabin. He went out and checked the padlock. Untouched. He went back to bed, but didn't sleep. He lay with his hands behind his head and looked at the ceiling and thought about the geometry of what was happening. Felix had sent someone to look for the original documents, which meant Felix knew the originals were somewhere they could be reached. Which meant Felix understood that photocopies weren't the whole problem. Which meant someone had told Felix about Constance's filing strategy. That last part bothered him. Constance's office wasn't large. He trusted her. But someone had moved fast. In the morning, he called Constance before 7 and told her what had happened. She was quiet for a moment. "Is the bottle still secure?" "Yes." "Move it today. Don't tell me where. Just somewhere it's not at your property." He thought about that. "All right." "And Gabe, I want to talk about your safety. If Felix is sending people to your cabin..." "I'm fine," he said. "I know you think that. I'm saying it's different now. The break-in attempt moves this from intimidation into a pattern of criminal behavior. I'm going to document it with the sheriff's office today." She paused. "I also want you to talk to Violet." "About what?" "About the fact that this is going to get harder before it gets easier. Felix's attorney filed a motion yesterday afternoon, claiming the newly presented evidence was obtained improperly. He's arguing chain of custody, trying to get the photocopies excluded. He can't argue the originals away if we can present them through proper channels, but he's going to try to make the photocopies worthless first. Her voice was steady. I need Violet to understand that the road ahead is longer than we hoped, and that there are people who are going to fight this at every step. She knows, Gabe said. I believe you. But she needs to hear it in terms of what it might cost her. Time, energy, being in a courtroom, having Tom's death examined publicly all over again. That's not a small thing. He drove to Myrtle Creek that afternoon. He took the medicine bottle first, before anything else. Drove 20 minutes south to the property of his friend Walt Mercer, a retired faller who lived on 10 acres outside Canyonville, and locked it in Walt's gun safe with the combination Walt gave him for emergencies. He didn't tell Walt what was in the box he was locking away. Walt didn't ask. That was the kind of friendship 30 years of timber work produced. Then he drove to Violet's. She answered the door in a canvas apron, her bent hands dusted with flour, which surprised him. Baking, she said, before he could say anything. It's the one thing the arthritis hasn't completely taken, as long as I don't rush. She stepped back to let him in. Sit down. I'll make coffee. While she made the coffee, he sat at the kitchen table and looked around at the house he hadn't seen much of on his first visit. It was a careful house, not fussy, but maintained with intention. The kind of house where things were put away because they had a place, and the place mattered. On the kitchen windowsill, 3 small ceramic pots with herbs, basil going leggy in the October light, rosemary still holding. On the refrigerator, a child's drawing held up with a magnet, 2 stick figures, and the word Grandma in large letters. He thought about what he'd come to say. He thought about the geometry of what it meant to ask a 68-year-old woman with arthritic hands and 20 years of unresolved grief to go back into a courtroom and hold still while men in expensive suits examined her husband's death for strategic advantage. Violet set the coffee on the table and sat down across from him. He told her about the break-in attempt, without dramatizing it. Then he told her what Constance had said, the longer road, the civil fight, Felix's attorneys working to exclude the photocopies, the possibility of a public trial that put Tom's death under a legal microscope all over again. She listened with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup. When he finished, she said, "What do you need to know?" "Whether you want to keep going," he said. "It's your call. It's always been your call." She looked at him steadily. The afternoon light came through the kitchen window and lay across the table between them. Tom worked timber for 26 years, she said. He was careful. He was the kind of careful that comes from taking the job seriously, from knowing that carelessness costs people their lives. He was not a man who died from inattention. She paused. "I have a grandchild. She's 8. She knows her grandfather died in the woods. Someday she's going to be old enough to look up what happened, and what she's going to find is a company investigation that says he wasn't paying attention." Violet set down her coffee cup. "I'm not leaving that record for her. I don't care what it costs." Gabe nodded. He didn't say anything for a moment. "There's one more thing," he said. "I need to get the originals to Constance through proper channels, filed with the court under evidence preservation order. That makes them untouchable. But to do it correctly, I need you to be part of the filing as the plaintiff. It means your name is on the court record." "My name has been on a court record before," she said. "Put it there." He drove back north through the rain. He was thinking about Violet's hands around the coffee cup, the flour on her apron, the grandchild's drawing on the refrigerator. He was thinking about the 8-year-old who would someday look up how her grandfather died. He thought about that for a long time. He was also thinking about Roy Hurd. Constance had located Hurd in Klamath Falls, retired, living alone, 71 years old. She'd written him a letter the previous week introducing herself and outlining the evidence that had been assembled. She'd told Gabe not to contact Hurd directly, to let the letter do its work. Gabe had agreed because Constance was better at this kind of work than he was, and he knew it. But it had been 6 days and he hadn't heard anything. He called Constance from his cabin that evening. "Hurd called me this morning," she said. Before he could respond, she continued. "He wants to talk. He's scared. That was clear in the first 30 seconds. He said he's been expecting a call like this for 15 years. A pause. "I'm driving to Klamath Falls on Friday." "What do you think he'll do?" "I think he'll cooperate. A man who's been expecting a call for 15 years has already decided what he'll do when it comes. He's just been waiting for someone to give him a reason." She was quiet for a moment. "If he cooperates and provides a full accounting, the case shifts from civil to criminal. That brings in the U.S. attorney. And Felix. Felix is already looking at this from every angle. His attorneys filed 2 motions today. He knows the walls are moving." Her voice was measured. "But Gabe, if Hurd cooperates, Felix will know it very quickly. That's when this becomes most dangerous. A man who understands that a criminal case is forming against him and has already demonstrated willingness to intimidate witnesses." She left the sentence unfinished. He understood what she was leaving unfinished. "I'll be careful," he said. "Don't be careful," she said. "Be smart. Those aren't always the same thing." He sat in the kitchen after he hung up. The rain had stopped and the night was clear for the first time in a week, the stars visible through the kitchen window above the tree line. Soot was asleep in the corner, legs moving slightly, the way they did when he was chasing something in a dream. Gabe thought about Harley Wooten writing in his notebook in his lunch pail at the end of a day. "I think Felix pays him. I can't prove it." He thought about Tom Clements walking up into Unit U.C. 47 on a September morning, checking his gear the way he always did, moving into a unit where an unmarked snag tree was waiting and nobody had told him to look for it, because the man responsible had signed a piece of paper saying it wasn't there. He thought about the Douglas fir that had fallen 300 years of waiting onto that mountainside and opened its hollow to a man with a chainsaw. He thought about paraffin wax and a brown glass bottle and the specific kind of man who hides his guilt in a tree and calls it insurance. He reached for the cedar figure on the table, the standing man in the hard hat, nearly finished now. He turned it in his hands. The face was rough still, just suggested. He picked up his smallest gouge and sat there in the quiet kitchen and worked on the face until it was something. Not a portrait. Not a likeness, just a man looking out at something in the middle distance, with the patience of someone who has been waiting a long time for something to come right. He set it down when it was done, 3 inches tall, standing. Outside, a logging truck went by on the county road, its lights sweeping the kitchen wall. The sound of it faded north toward Roseburg and was gone. He was still sitting there when his phone rang. The number was Constance's cell. It was nearly 10 o'clock at night. He picked up. "Roy Hurd called me back," she said. "He doesn't want to wait until Friday. He wants to meet tomorrow." Roy Hurd lived in a house on the east side of Klamath Falls, 3 blocks from the lake. A single-story ranch house with a gravel driveway and a juniper hedge that needed trimming. Constance had asked Gabe to come. She wanted him present when Hurd gave his account, as a witness who could testify to what was said. They drove down separately and arrived within 10 minutes of each other on a Thursday morning, the sky over the Cascades sharp and cold, the lake visible at the end of the street in long silver panels. Hurd answered the door himself. He was 71, thin, with the careful posture of a man who'd spent years behind a desk and hadn't entirely left it behind. His hair was white and cut close, his eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, the watchful kind, not nervous exactly, but alert in the way of someone who had been expecting a knock for a long time and was still surprised to hear it. He shook Constance's hand and then Gabe's, holding Gabe's a moment longer, like he needed to know what kind of man he was dealing with. "Come in," he said. "I made coffee." They sat at his kitchen table. The house was neat and unremarkable. The house of a man living alone with his habits. A stack of library books on the counter. A calendar on the wall with bird photographs, open to October. Through the back window, a small yard with a dry bird bath and a row of junipers along the fence. Hurd set the coffee down and sat across from them with his hands flat on the table. He didn't wait for them to start. "I took money from Felix Eastman," he said. "Starting in the spring of 2002 and ending in the summer of 2007. $1,500 per quarter, paid through a sole proprietorship I set up for the purpose. I reduced the frequency of surprise inspections on Pacific Ridge timber units in exchange for those payments. I was the regional compliance officer for Douglas County. I knew what my job was. I did the opposite of it." He said it the way a man recites something he's rehearsed, not because he didn't mean it, but because he'd been saying it to himself for 15 years and the words had worn smooth. Constance had her legal pad open. She didn't write anything yet. How did the arrangement begin? "Felix approached me at a regional timber safety conference in Portland, spring of 2002. He was cordial. We'd met professionally a few times before. He suggested we have dinner. Over dinner, he made the offer. He framed it as a consulting arrangement, said the company needed consistent relationships with the regulatory office, less disruption from unannounced inspections. He used the word partnership." Hurd looked at his coffee cup. "I knew what it was." "And you agreed?" "I needed the money. My wife was sick. She died in 2005, but in those years she was sick in the expensive way that exhausts insurance. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I wasn't doing anything except adjusting a schedule." He paused. "I inspected every Pacific Ridge unit eventually. I just reduced the surprise element. Felix knew when I was coming. He had time to present the units cleanly or to file his corrected reports before I arrived." He looked at Gabe directly. "The hazards I should have been finding, they were there. I just wasn't finding them on the right days." "Were you aware of the fatalities?" Constance asked. "I signed the no violation findings for all three." His voice didn't change. "Tom Clements in 2004, Harley Wooten in 2005, Cody Ferris in 2007. He was quiet for a moment. "After Clements, I tried to end the arrangement. I told Felix I was done. He reminded me that I'd cashed $6,000 in payments, that the arrangement was documented on his end, and that if I stopped cooperating, he'd make sure the documentation reached the right people." Hurd looked out the back window at the dry bird bath. "So I kept going, through 2 more deaths." The kitchen was quiet. Somewhere outside a car went by. Hurd turned back from the window. "I have the payment records," he said. "Every check, every deposit. I kept them. I don't know why. Maybe because I needed to keep looking at what I'd done. I have them in a file in my study." "I'll need everything," Constance said. "I know." He got up and went to the study and came back with a manila envelope, thick with paper, and set it on the table between them. "I also have correspondence. Felix sent me 2 letters in the early years, before he understood that a phone call was safer. They're in there." Constance opened the envelope and looked at the top sheet without touching it further. She looked at Gabe. He gave her a small nod. "Mr. Hurd," she said, "I'm going to recommend that you engage your own attorney before we go any further. What you've told us today, and what's in this envelope, constitutes a significant criminal exposure for you. Cooperation with the U.S. Attorney's Office can substantially affect your outcome, but you need representation before you make that decision." "I understand," Hurd said. "I've been waiting to make that call for 15 years. I just needed someone to knock first." Constance contacted the U.S. Attorney's Office in Portland 2 days later, with Hurd's payment records, his written account, Felix's letters, Harley Wooten's notebook, Owen Phelps's payment documents, and the photocopies of the dual inspection reports. The U.S. Attorney assigned a federal prosecutor and an FBI agent named Lena Kimball within the week. Gabe drove to Portland to provide his statement, how he'd found the bottle, what it contained, how he'd handled the originals, where the originals were currently secured. Lena Kimball was a compact, efficient woman who listened to everything Gabe said with complete attention and asked questions that were short and precise. When he finished, she said, "The tree tag, U.C. 47, September 12, 2004. You have this tag. It's with the originals in the safe in Canyonville. We'll need it. If we can match it to the BLM cutting unit maps, it puts Felix in that unit the morning Tom Clements died, Gabe said. She looked at him. Yes. She wrote something on her pad. We'll subpoena the BLM records. The original unit designation maps from 2004 should still be in their archive. She closed her pad. I want to be honest with you, Mr. Tillman. Cases like this take time. We're going to do this correctly, which means we're going to do it slowly. Don't expect a quick resolution. He drove back to Douglas County in the dark, the headlights of his Ford pulling the two-lane highway through the timber country in long yellow cones. He stopped in Canyonville and retrieved the medicine bottle from Walt's gun safe, with Lena Kimball's evidence bag in his hand. He held the bottle for a moment before he put it in the bag. The brown glass, the smoky patina of decades, the wax still crumbling at the mouth where he'd pried it off that October morning on the mountain. He thought about whoever had sealed it, Felix, presumably, or someone Felix had trusted, pressing that wax down and sliding the bottle into the hollow of the fur and walking away from it. Keeping his insurance, leaving his guilt in the dark. He sealed the evidence bag and drove to Portland the next morning and handed it to Lena Kimball in the federal building lobby. The FBI executed the search warrant at Felix Eastman's log house outside Drain on a Tuesday morning in November, 3 weeks after Gabe's statement. He wasn't there for it. He heard about it from Constance, who heard about it from the federal prosecutor's office in the standard chain of notifications. They found the filing cabinet in Felix's workshop, behind a wall of chainsaw carvings, bears and eagles and a large buck, displayed on rough wooden shelving that had been built specifically to fill that section of wall. The cabinet held organized copies of every falsified report Felix had filed over 6 years, divided by unit and date with notation tabs. Felix had kept his own record of the whole operation, meticulously organized, the way a careful man kept accounts. It was, Constance said, the most useful thing he could possibly have left in existence, and he'd been keeping it for 16 years. Behind the last drawer of the cabinet, in a cardboard box taped to the back panel, was the brown glass medicine bottle. Gabe's bottle. The originals were already in federal custody. Gabe had handed them over 3 weeks earlier, but the presence of the bottle in Felix's workshop proved Felix had broken into Gabe's property and taken it. The FBI also found Felix's handwritten payment ledger, separate from the filing cabinet, in a locked desk drawer. It matched Roy Hurd's records down to the dollar and date on every entry. Felix Eastman was arrested at the Roseburg Harvest Craft Fair on a Saturday, where he was selling his chainsaw carvings from a folding table beside a wooden bear he'd carved from a cedar round. 2 federal agents in plain clothes walked up to his table while he was making change for a customer. He looked up at them and knew immediately. Gabe heard later that he didn't say anything, didn't argue, just set down the change he was holding and put his hands out. The image of a careful man at the end of something he'd been managing for a long time. Gabe heard about it from Constance's call at midday. He was at the landing, finishing his last load of the week. He sat in the cab of his truck and listened to her explain the details of the arrest, the charges being prepared, the timeline for arraignment. When she finished, he said, "The tree tag, did it match?" "BLM confirmed it this morning," she said. "Cutting Unit U.C. 47, September 12, 2004. Felix was the designated safety officer for that unit. He signed the falsified clearance at 7:42 in the morning." A pause. "Tom Clements died at approximately 10:15. Gabe sat with that for a moment. 2 hours and 33 minutes between Felix's signature and a man walking into a unit where a dead fir with rotted roots was waiting for the yarder vibration to bring it down. "All right," he said. He hung up and sat in the truck. Soot was beside him on the seat, and Gabe put one hand on the dog's back and sat looking through the windshield at the stump of a fir at the edge of the landing. Not the same tree, not the Douglas fir from the cutting unit on the mountain, just a stump from last week's work, the growth ring showing pale and wet at the cut face. He sat there until the fog came rolling down the drainage from the north, the way it did most afternoons in November, filling in the spaces between the trees until the trees were shapes, and then suggestions, and then gone. The federal trial began on a Monday in March in the United States District Court in Portland. Gabe drove up the night before and stayed in a motel off the interstate, a room that smelled of carpet cleaner and old heat, with a window that looked at the parking structure across the street. He didn't sleep well. He lay on top of the covers in his work clothes and looked at the ceiling and thought about nothing in particular, which was how he'd always managed the night before a difficult day, emptying out like a bucket set down before it needs to carry water. He testified on the second day. Lena Kimball had prepared him well. She'd told him to answer what was asked, say he didn't know if he didn't know, and not offer more than the question required. He sat in the witness box in his one good shirt, the courtroom larger and more formal than he'd expected, and answered the questions from the federal prosecutor in the same order he'd told the story a dozen times by now. The hollow in the fur, the medicine bottle, the paraffin seal, the dual reports, Felix Eastman's signature, the tree tag. Felix's defense attorney, not Wallace Corbett this time, a Portland firm that charged accordingly, cross-examined Gabe for 40 minutes, working at the chain of custody for the originals, the gap between when Gabe found the bottle and when he handed it to federal custody. Gabe answered each question the same way he answered a hard cut, steadily, without rushing, without letting the pressure change the line. He didn't give the attorney anything he hadn't already given the prosecutor, and when it was over, he walked back to his seat and didn't look at Felix. Felix had been sitting at the defense table every day in a dark suit and a face that had closed down to something unreadable. He was 63 years old now and looked it. The comfortable weight he'd carried and drained had come off him in the months since his arrest, and the practiced friendliness was gone, replaced by a careful blankness that might have been composure or might have been the face of a man who had finally run out of moves. Gabe had looked at him once on the first morning and then found he had nothing more to learn from looking. Roy Hurd testified on the fourth day. He sat in the same witness box in a brown suit that was too large for him, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the courtroom light, and he gave the same account he'd given at Gabe's kitchen table in Klamath Falls. Clear, sequential, without evasion. He was 71 years old, and he'd been carrying the shape of this testimony for 15 years, and it showed. He was tired in the way of a man who has put down a heavy thing and is relieved and ashamed in equal measure. When the prosecutor asked him directly whether his reduced inspection schedule had contributed to the 3 fatalities, he said yes without hesitation. Yes. His voice didn't shake. He just said the word and let it sit there. Owen Phelps testified to the payment records from Pacific Ridge's accounts payable. Nadine Wooten submitted Harley's notebook as a documentary exhibit, and the prosecutor read 3 entries from it aloud, including the one about Roy Hurd and the adjusted inspection schedule. Harley Wooten had been dead for 19 years, but his handwriting was in the courtroom. The trial lasted 9 days. Felix Eastman's defense argued throughout that he had been acting under pressure from Pacific Ridge Timber's corporate management, that production quotas had made the falsifications a matter of company culture rather than individual criminality. The defense put 2 former Pacific Ridge executives on the stand to support this argument. The prosecutor then introduced Felix's personal payment ledger, the one from the locked desk drawer, showing $41,200 in payments to Roy Hurd from Felix's personal account, not the company's. That was the end of the company pressure defense. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Felix Eastman was convicted on 19 counts. 3 counts of involuntary manslaughter, bribery of a public official, obstruction of justice, falsification of federal safety records, and breaking and entering. The manslaughter counts carried the heaviest weight. The judge sentenced him to 22 years in federal custody with eligibility for parole after 16. He was 63 years old. Roy Hurd, under a cooperation agreement with the U.S. Attorney's Office, received 3 years with eligibility for parole after 18 months, and permanent forfeiture of his state pension. He was transferred to a minimum security facility outside Salem. His attorney told Constance that Heard had described the day of his testimony as the first day in 15 years he'd slept without dreaming. The court ordered Pacific Ridge Timber's successor company, a land investment trust that had acquired the Oregon timberlands in 2008, to pay $2,100,000 in restitution divided between the three families. The trust's attorneys contested the figure for 4 months before settling. Violet Clemens's wrongful death case was reopened the week after Felix's conviction and resolved in a settlement of $680,000. More important to Violet and to Gabe was the formal correction of Tom Clemens's death record. The official finding of the 2004 investigation, worker inattention, failure to maintain situational awareness, was vacated and replaced with a new determination: death caused by a concealed known hazard, specifically an identified snag tree falsely reported as removed prior to operations. Violet's attorney had the corrected finding filed with the Douglas County Clerk's office and certified. She got a copy in the mail on a Tuesday in June on a single sheet of official paper, and she called Gabe to tell him it had arrived. "How do you feel?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Like something that was leaning finally stood up straight," she said. Oregon OSHA announced a statewide review of all timber safety inspections conducted between 2001 and 2010, specifically targeting inspections that had been preceded by company-filed corrective reports. The review identified irregularities in 4 additional timber operations and referred 2 of them to the State Attorney General's office. The Oregon legislature the following year passed a law requiring all timber safety inspections to be filed digitally within 24 hours of completion, with independent third-party verification required for any corrective filing. The bill was named the Clements-Wooten-Ferris Workplace Safety Act. It passed the Senate 31-0. In the summer after the trial, Gabe drove down to Myrtle Creek one Saturday with a carved figure wrapped in a cloth on the passenger seat. Violet had her neighbor girl working in the garden when he arrived, a teenager in rubber boots, cutting back the overgrown beds along the front walk with the focused energy of someone who liked the work. The roses along the south wall were coming back, red and irregular, the way roses come back when they've been neglected and then given attention again. Violet was on the porch. She'd set up a small table with 2 glasses of iced tea, which told him she'd been expecting him around this time, which she probably had. He'd been coming down every month or so since the trial, not for any particular reason, just to sit on the porch and talk about the weather and the timber market, and occasionally about Tom. The way you talk about someone when the talking has moved past grief into something more like memory. He set the carved figure on the table between them, a woman 3 inches tall, standing with her hands at her sides. The face was just a suggestion. He'd kept it simple on purpose. Violet picked it up and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. "That's good work," she said finally. "It's not finished," he said. "I kept not knowing how to finish it. It looks finished to me." She set it beside her iced tea glass, and they sat for a while. The neighbor girl was working her way along the front walk, and from somewhere down the street came the sound of a lawnmower, and the afternoon had that particular quality of late summer in western Oregon. The light coming in low and golden through the firs, the air smelling of warm earth and something green underneath. Violet had her hands around her glass, the arthritis bent at every knuckle, and she was watching the roses with the expression of a woman who has decided that watching something grow back is enough. 3 months later, on a morning in October, Gabe drove to the cutting unit on the North Umpqua drainage and hiked up the slope. The stump of the Douglas fir was 4 feet across and already going gray at the cut face, the growth rings showing in concentric circles, each one a year of rain and drought and wind and the slow accumulation of wood, 300 years of it, now open to the sky. Moss had started at the edges. In another decade, the stump would be a nurse log, breaking down into the duff, feeding the seedlings that had already started coming up around it in the gap where the canopy had opened. Gabe stood on the stump and looked out through the gap at the North Umpqua below, running fast and silver in the October light. The fog was just beginning to lift off the river. The air smelled of wet fir bark and cold water, and the particular clean smell of the mountains after rain. He reached into his vest pocket and took out the wooden figure he'd been carrying since he carved it. The standing man in the hard hat, 3 inches tall, the face looking out at something in the middle distance. He'd carried it for almost a year, and it had gotten smooth from handling, the grain of the cedar polished by his pocket and his hands, until it felt like something that had been in the world a long time. He set it on the stump. He placed it carefully, facing the river. Then he stood back and looked at it for a moment. 3 inches of cedar on 4 feet of fir on a mountainside above the North Umpqua in Douglas County, Oregon, where 3 men had gone to work one morning and hadn't come back, and where a tree that had been standing since before the county existed had finally fallen and given up what was hidden in its heart. He called Soot, who had been investigating something at the base of the outcrop nearby. The dog came to him at a trot, looked once at the figure on the stump, and fell in beside him. Gabe walked down the mountain. Behind him, the wooden man stood on the stump, looking out at the river, and the forest was quiet around him in the way of places that have finished with something and are ready to begin again.